Story number 1. The Shadows of Greystone Manor. The legend of Greystone Manor was well known in the sleepy town of Coldwater. Perched on a hill, the sprawling estate had been abandoned for decades, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. Locals whispered about the tragedy that befell the Carrington family, how they vanished one stormy night without a trace, leaving behind a house steeped in silence and unease. When Sophie inherited the manor from an uncle she'd never met, she saw it as an opportunity. A place to start over after her recent divorce. Despite the warnings from townsfolk, she packed her belongings and drove to Coldwater, determined to reclaim the old family estate. The house loomed as she arrived, its Gothic spires cutting into the gray sky. The front gate creaked on rusty hinges, and the driveway was overgrown with weeds. Yet Sophie felt a strange pull toward the place, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was heavy and musty, carrying the scent of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the corners like forgotten memories. But beneath the neglect, the house still held a haunting beauty. The intricate woodwork, the stained glass windows, the grand staircase that spiraled upward like a skeletal spine. Sophie set to work immediately, determined to make the manor livable. She scrubbed floors, polished banisters, and unpacked boxes late into the night. It wasn't until her second evening in the house that she noticed the noises. It began with faint footsteps overhead, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing in the attic. Sophie froze, her heart pounding. She grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs to investigate. The attic was empty, but as she stood there, the beam of her flashlight caught something. A single footprint in the dust, fresh and unmistakably human. That night, Sophie struggled to sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself the footprint had been her own, left behind while exploring earlier. Then she heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. She sat up, clutching the blankets tightly. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Summoning her courage, she stepped into the hallway, her bare feet sinking into the thick carpet. The flashlight in her hand cast long, shifting shadows on the walls. The corridor was empty. But just as she turned to go back to bed, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. At the far end of the hallway, where the light didn't quite reach, a figure stood. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, its features obscured. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figure didn't move. Terrified, she backed into her room and slammed the door, bolting it shut. She spent the rest of the night huddled under the blankets, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next morning, Sophie resolved to leave. Whatever inheritance this house represented wasn't worth her sanity. But as she packed, she noticed something chilling. The front door wouldn't open. She twisted the knob, yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were locked tight, their latches immovable. "Come on," she muttered, panic rising. "This can't be happening." As she struggled with the doors, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Whipping around, she saw nothing but the empty foyer. Then the whispers began. Low and guttural, they seemed to come from the walls themselves. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. Desperate, Sophie grabbed her phone to call for help, but the screen was blank. No signal, no power. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Sophie covered her ears, backing into the living room where the air felt thick and oppressive. That's when she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were pale and featureless, their forms flickering like candle flames. They moved slowly, their empty eyes fixed on her. Sophie screamed and ran upstairs, slamming the door to the master bedroom behind her. She pressed her back against it, her chest heaving. The voices were in the room now, whispering her name. In the corner, the full-length mirror began to fog over, as though someone were breathing on the other side. Slowly, words appeared, written in the condensation, "You can't leave." Sophie backed away, trembling. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and a hand pressed through. A pale, skeletal hand that reached for her. She turned and fled, running down the hallway toward the attic. It was the only place left to hide. The attic door slammed shut behind her, and she collapsed against the wall, sobbing. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. But then she felt it, a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the tall figure from the hallway. It stood mere inches away, its shadowy form towering over her. This time, its face was visible, a hollow skull with empty sockets, grinning as it reached out. Days later, when the townsfolk ventured up to the manor, they found it empty. Sophie was gone, her belongings untouched, and the door to the attic was locked. From inside the house, faint whispers could be heard, calling out to anyone who dared to listen. The manor had claimed another. Story number 2, The Forgotten Tunnel. It was supposed to be a shortcut. When Alex's car broke down on a desolate road, he decided to walk back to town. His phone had died hours ago, and the sun was slipping below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and deep purple. A few miles down the road, he found a weathered sign pointing toward an old pedestrian tunnel cutting through the hillside. Foster Tunnel, 1 mile, it read. The idea of shaving off some time appealed to Alex. The faster he got back to town, the better. The tunnel was carved into the hillside, its entrance a gaping maw shrouded in shadows. Graffiti covered the concrete walls, and rusted chain-link fencing stood on either side. A faint, damp smell wafted out, and Alex hesitated. "It's just a tunnel," he muttered to himself. "Probably just looks worse than it is." With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The air grew colder almost immediately, and the sound of his footsteps echoed unnervingly. The light from the tunnel's entrance faded behind him, leaving only the beam of his small flashlight to guide the way. As Alex walked, he noticed strange things on the walls, scratches, carvings, and symbols he didn't recognize. Some were crude, others intricate, and all of them felt wrong, as though they didn't belong in a place like this. About halfway through, he heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like something dragging along the ground. "Hello?" Alex called, his voice bouncing off the walls. The shuffling stopped. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but saw nothing except the damp, cracked concrete. His pulse quickened, but he pressed on, determined not to let his imagination get the better of him. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. But as he moved deeper into the tunnel, it grew louder, low guttural voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. Alex's steps faltered. He swung the flashlight wildly, its beam catching only empty walls and patches of water pooling on the floor. "Is someone there?" he demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. The whispering stopped. And then something moved. At the edge of his flashlight's reach, a figure stepped into view. It was hunched and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Milky white eyes stared unblinkingly at Alex, and its lips pulled back into a jagged grin, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. Alex stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What? What are you?" he stammered. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, almost curious, before stepping closer. Alex turned and ran. The tunnel seemed longer now, impossibly so, and the light from the exit remained maddeningly far away. Behind him, he could hear the shuffling, the scrape of claws against concrete, and the faint, wheezing sound of something trying to laugh. His lungs burned as he sprinted, his footsteps splashing through puddles. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him as though the tunnel itself were alive. When he finally burst out into the open air, he didn't stop running until he reached the main road. It wasn't until he flagged down a passing truck that he dared to look back. The tunnel loomed in the distance, its entrance dark and still. But as the truck drove away, Alex swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the shadows, its milky white eyes following him. The next day, Alex told his story to a friend in town. "Foster Tunnel?" his friend said, frowning. "That's been sealed off for decades. No one's been through there in years." Alex shook his head. "No, I was there last night. The entrance is open." His friend paled. "It shouldn't be," he said quietly. "They closed it after people started disappearing. And the ones who made it out." He trailed off, his face grim. "What about them?" Alex asked. "They all swore something followed them out." That night, Alex locked every door and window in his house, but as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And when he turned out the light, he heard it again, the whispering. Story number 3, The Lantern Keeper. The village of Black Hollow had a tradition, one older than anyone could remember. Each year, as the first frost touched the ground, a single person would be chosen to keep the lantern burning at the edge of the forest. They called it the Watcher's Lantern. The villagers never spoke of what the lantern was meant to ward off or why it had to remain lit from dusk until dawn. But everyone obeyed the tradition without question. Those who didn't, well, no one ever broke the rules and lived to tell the tale. This year the responsibility fell to Eliza, a young woman who had moved to Black Hollow only a few months prior. She had taken over her late aunt's cottage and was eager to make a good impression on the close-knit community. When the village elder handed her the lantern and instructed her to keep it burning through the cold, moonless nights, she laughed nervously. "Superstition?" she asked. The elder's expression hardened. Number A warning. Eliza set up her post near the forest's edge just as the sun dipped below the horizon. She placed the lantern on the sturdy iron hook embedded in the ground and sat on the bench nearby, pulling her coat tighter against the biting wind. The forest before her was dense, the skeletal branches of trees twisting together like black veins. Even in the daylight, it looked unwelcoming. Now, in the dark, it felt alive, like it was watching her. At first, nothing happened. The lantern's soft, golden glow flickered in the cold air, and Eliza entertained herself by reading a book she'd brought along. The minutes dragged into hours, and she began to wonder if the villagers were simply pulling her leg. Then she heard it. A faint rustling, deeper within the forest. She froze, her eyes darting toward the trees. The sound was too deliberate to be the wind. It was rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through leaves. "Eliza," a voice whispered from the darkness. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Eliza," the voice called again, soft and inviting. It sounded familiar, like her mother's voice. But her mother had died years ago. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then the lantern flickered. "No," she whispered, rushing to adjust the wick. The flame sputtered but held. She exhaled in relief, but when she turned back to the forest, she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the lantern's glow. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glimmered faintly, reflecting the lantern's light. "Eliza," it said again, though its mouth didn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen with fear. The figure stepped closer, the lantern's light revealing more of its grotesque form. Its skin was ashen and stretched taut over sharp bones. It raised one spindly hand and pointed at the lantern. "Let it die," it whispered. Eliza shook her head, clutching the lantern tightly. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice was barely more than a squeak. The figure let out a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down her spine. "You don't belong here," it hissed. "This is our place." The lantern flickered again, the flame shrinking dangerously low. Panic surged through Eliza as she fumbled to adjust it, her fingers trembling. The figure stepped closer still, now just at the edge of the light. Its presence seemed to sap the warmth from the air, leaving her breath visible in the freezing night. "Eliza," it said again, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Let it die." She did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the lantern and held it high, the light casting wild shadows across the forest floor. "Stay away!" she screamed. The figure recoiled slightly, as though the light burned it, but it didn't retreat. Instead, More figures began to emerge from the shadows, their grotesque forms swaying as they crept toward her. There were dozens of them now, surrounding her, their voices merging into a cacophony of whispers. "Let it die. Let it die. Let it die." Eliza's grip on the lantern tightened. She backed away, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The figures stopped just short of the lantern's glow, their hollow eyes fixed on her. And then the flame went out. Darkness swallowed her. Eliza screamed, frantically striking a match to relight the lantern. The first match snapped. The second fizzled in the damp air. The whispers grew louder, the figures closing in. Finally, on her third try, the lantern's flame roared to life. The golden light pushed the creatures back, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Eliza collapsed to her knees, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. When dawn broke, the villagers found her at the forest's edge, the lantern still burning in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She said nothing as they helped her to her feet, her gaze fixed on the forest as though it might reach out and drag her back. From that day on, Eliza never spoke of what she'd seen. But every year, as the first frost touched the ground, she was the first to volunteer to keep the lantern burning. Because now she understood. Some things must never be allowed to step into the light.